For hundreds of years, England and France had fought each other in Europe. After they established colonies in North America, the fighting continued. Inhabitants of the colonies, white, black, and Native American, found themselves involved in struggles that had begun in Europe over issues that had little importance to Americans. But because the colonists cared which nation controlled the largest part of the continent, they fought willingly on England's side. In the colony, King William's War at the end of the 1600s, Queen Anne's War during the first decade and a half of the 1700s, and King George's War in the middle of the 1700s were fought, and all these conflicts were inconclusive. Neither side was ever able to achieve an unqualified victory in America or Europe. If the European disputes that started these three wars seemed irrelevant to white colonists, they were even less meaningful to Native Americans. But Native American nations reaped advantages from the battles between European powers as each side, the English and French, tried to lure Native American nations to align themselves with trade benefits and other promises. Above all, Native Americans of the interior of North America wanted to protect their territory from white settlement and avoid the fate of Native American people along the Atlantic coast. Most of the tribes concluded that their goals could best be achieved by maintaining outward neutrality and playing European powers against one another. Their strategy was very successful as long as the Europeans were evenly matched during wartime. The conditions that allowed Native American nations to preserve the balance of power in the American interior ended forever with the close of the conflict known as the 7 Years' War. It's also known as the French and Indian War, which is fought from 1756 to 1763. What distinguished this war from its predecessors was not only that England won decisively, but also because it began on the North American continent and not in Europe. So, for the first time, a war spread to Europe from America rather than the other way around. Specifically, the war rose from the clash between England and France over which nation would dominate land west of the Appalachian Mountains. Because that land was the home of interior Native American nations, they became involved in the struggle as well. In 1753, the French began to push southward from Lake Erie into the Ohio country. That threat stimulated an intercolonial conference in June of 1754. Encouraged by authorities in London, delegates from 7 northern and middle colonies met with representatives of the Iroquois Nation at Albany, New York, in an attempt to persuade the Iroquois Native American nations to ally themselves with the British. But the Albany Congress failed to convince the Iroquois tribes to abandon neutrality. The delegates at Albany also adopted a plan of union designed to coordinate the defenses of the colonies. They proposed the establishment of an elected intercolonial legislature with the power to tax, headed by a president general appointed by the king. But the individual colonial governments feared losing their control, their autonomy, and rejected the idea. The Albany Congress failed to achieve its major objectives, but it did produce an enduring symbol of union created by Benjamin Franklin, his famous cartoon of a segmented snake, captioned, "Join or Die." The delegates to the Congress did not know that while they deliberated, the war they sought to prepare for was already beginning. The governor of Virginia, which claimed the region that is now western Pennsylvania, had sent a small militia force westward to counter the French moves. the French had already taken possession of a strategic point, which is now Pittsburgh, and they were building Fort Duquesne there. The young and inexperienced colonel who commanded this militia was captured by the French, and after surrendering, he and his men were allowed to return to Virginia. The young George Washington had made a tremendous blunder. He had sparked a war that would eventually involve the entire world. In 1755, General Edward Braddock, with two regiments and some colonial troops, suffered a disastrous defeat a few miles south of Fort Duquesne, and for the next 3 years, the French were consistently victorious. Finally, under the leadership of William Pitt, who was named Secretary of State in 1757, the British mounted the effort that won them the war in North America. They captured the French fortress at Louisbourg in 1758, the French fort at Quebec in 1759, and Fort Montreal, the last French stronghold, in 1760. The war was over, but it continued elsewhere for 3 more years. When the Treaty of Paris was finally signed in 1763, France gave up its major North American holdings to England. Spain, an ally of France toward the end of the war, gave Florida to England, and since England feared the presence of France in the massive territory of Louisiana, it forced France to give Spain, a weaker power, that region. The English colonies along the Atlantic coast no longer had to worry about the French threat to their existence. In order to achieve the stunning victory, Pitt had to alter many of the policies his predecessor had pursued in his dealings with the colonies. When the war began, the English intended to rely heavily on American colonists to enlist, but after English defeats, enlistments dropped and English officers adopted aggressive techniques to fill their ranks. In 1757, American crowds resisted forced recruitment in New York City and elsewhere. Other classes developed over the Army's heavy-handed attempts to take wagons and supplies from American farmers and merchants and to house troops in private homes whenever public accommodations were inadequate. In 1758, Pitt acted to ease strains that were threatening to disrupt the English-American war effort. He agreed to reimburse the colonies for their military expenditures and placed the recruitment of American troops in the hands of the colonists. The result was an immediate increase in the number and enthusiasm of colonial volunteers. The colonial governments, assured of financial aid from England, began to devote more of their resources to the task of winning the war. At the same time, Pitt dispatched a large number of English forces to the colonies. The well-trained English troops did most of the actual fighting, with the colonial troops used for support roles. Pitt's measures won the war, but they also caused problems between colonists and English troops. English commanders could not understand why the colonies seemed so reluctant to contribute to the war effort. They were especially angry at merchants who continued to trade with the French West Indies. English officers and troops looked down on their American counterparts as undisciplined and ignorant of military procedures. For their part, Americans resented the condescending attitudes of the English, and American soldiers and civilians were annoyed by the restrictions imposed on their behavior by military regulations. In the years after 1760, wartime friction contributed to the growing tensions between the colonies and England. It was several years before white colonists felt the full impact of the English victory in the French and Indian War. The Indians, however, felt it almost immediately. The Ottawas and their neighbors, the Chippewas and the Potawatomis, became angry when England, lacking French competition, raised the price of trade goods, and ended the French custom of giving them ammunition for hunting. Even more significantly, the English refused to pay the customary rent for forts established within tribal territory. They also permitted white settlers to move past the Appalachian Mountains into territory which belonged to the Iroquois and Delawares. The English were signaling their disregard for Native American claims of sovereignty over the interior of North America. Pontiac, the Ottawa chief, who realized the meaning of the British victory, had been a loyal ally of the French since the 1740s. In early May, he attacked Fort Detroit, while his war parties attacked the other British posts in the Great Lakes region. Detroit withstood the attack, but by the end of June, all the other forts west of Niagara and north of Fort Pitt, which had been the French Fort Duquesne, had fallen to the Indian Alliance. This was the high point of the Native American uprising. The Native American nations raided Virginia and Pennsylvania frontiers at will throughout the summer, killing at least 2,000 white colonists, but they could not take Fort Niagara, Fort Pitt, or Fort Detroit. In early August, a combined Native American force was defeated in Pennsylvania by troops sent from the coast. Conflict ended when Pontiac broke off the attack of Fort Detroit in late October. A formal treaty ending the war was finally negotiated in 1766. Pontiac's uprising showed that England would not find it easy to govern the huge interior that it had just acquired from France. In October 1763, in a futile attempt to assert control over the interior, the Proclamation of 1763 was issued declaring that the western boundary of the colonial settlement would be the rivers flowing from the Appalachian Mountains. The proclamation was intended to prevent future clashes between Native Americans and colonists by forbidding white colonists from moving onto Native American lands until the tribes had given up that land by treaty. But many white colonists had already established farms west of this line, and the policy was doomed to failure from the very beginning. The 7 Years' War changed the political landscape of North America for all its inhabitants. Native Americans could no longer use neutrality to gain advantages from competing European powers. The British were now the dominant power on the continent. But that dominance came with a price. The British now not only had to deal with ongoing tensions with Native American nations in the interior of the continent, it also had to deal with growing tensions with the colonists as well.